This is Tracy and Kathy coming to you again for our second webinar based on the Moberg CNS Monitor. Before we kind of dive into things, just maybe you didn't join us for the last webinar, which was back in August. And for those of you who did, if you've come back, thank you very much. So we've set up these webinars as a way to touch base with you who are our customers and our other clinical colleagues in hopes to be able to give you a little bit of information about the CNS monitor, but then also for you to be able to ask us questions so that we can answer questions that you may have. So this Zoom program that we're using automatically mutes you as the participant, but there is a chat window. So what we would ask is just that you, if you have any questions, just go ahead and pop those into the chat window, and we'll address those as we go along. Excuse me. And then we'll go ahead and talk about those things. So Kathy and I are going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some features of the CNS monitor. The last time we were all on together, we went through the protocol steps, which are over here on the left-hand side. We talked about the displays that are available within a particular step, so that's always helpful. We talked a little bit about how to change parameters, change the time scale. Excuse me, 1 minute. Pardon me. How to change the time scale and how to change the amplitude scale. So if you have any questions about those and you didn't see the webinar the last time, before we get started, what I'd like to do is show you where you can go back and you can re-review the webinar that we did previously. And you can also get some other great resources for information from Moberg. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually stop my video now that you've had a chance to say hi. And that will help with some of our recording for a little bit. So let me go ahead and hopefully stop my video. That looks like that worked. And I'm actually going to switch my screen over to my Google screen. So all I've done is type Moberg into Google, and I picked the one that talks about Moberg Home. And if you've never been to the website, I would encourage you to visit it because there's a lot of great information there. So in addition to telling you kind of what the company is up to, there's events, there's news, and the two tabs that I want to bring your particular attention to are these ones at the end. One of them says webinars and one of them is support. If you actually tap on webinars, you will find actually the first one that pops up is the previous webinar that Kathy and I did back in August. So it might take a minute for the script to load for you to be able to scroll down. So it's been linked via YouTube, I believe. And so this is our previous webinar. So you can click on that and you can watch it again, or you can watch it for the first time if you didn't catch us in August. And it just gives you an idea of what we talked about and when it was recorded. And then if you continue to scroll, you will find a series of other webinars that have been done. And you can pick topics that might be of interest to you and watch those directly from the website. So we would encourage you guys to definitely take a look at that. So the other banner that was at the top that talked about, that was next to webinars, actually has a support button. So I'm going to go to support. And this is not just specifically for technical support. If you want to have access to different manuals, different instructions, some of the technology bulletins that we publish, you can actually set up an account with Moberg. And all you have to do is provide your email and register for the account, and then you'll get a login. They'll assign that to you. And then you can actually get into this education tab, and you can have access to different support products, different technical bulletins, and those sort of things. So I would encourage you to do that. Anybody in the institution can do that, unless you want to just designate that for a particular clinical specialist or educator, but really anyone can do it. And that opens up a lot more opportunities for you to get support from the website and to access some of the educational things that are provided there. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you. And I'm going to go back to the CNS monitor screen now, hopefully. Let's see if that gets us back. Okay, So Kathy, are you going to keep kind of track of questions and things? Because with this open, my view doesn't really show like the control panel.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll keep an eye on that. So if you either want to type them in the chat area or type them in the Q&A, I'll feed them to Tracy, or we can unmute you if it seems like a more complex question.
Very good. Thanks very much. So one of the things that I thought I would do is the last time we talked, we talked a little bit about changing displays. So if you wanted to change a parameter from something to something else, the way we focused on doing that the last time was actually tapping on the parameter itself, and then typically it will turn gray, and we're going to go up to this Edit Selected button, and then we can change the measurement from within there. But what if we come across the scenario where the measurement that we want isn't there? So for example, right now I have the screen, the display set to give us arterial blood pressure. So we're going to assume that this is coming from an arterial line, and we want to have this displayed. But we know that there are times where the arterial lines don't function anymore. Perhaps they fall out. Perhaps we're just waiting for one to get put back in. But we still want to be able to monitor blood pressure, in which case we would likely use a cuff. So we would be using a non-invasive blood pressure. So if we still want to be able to capture blood pressure and we go to the measurement and we try to find and change that to non-invasive blood pressure, the only choices we have under hemodynamic right now are ABP, CBP, and heart rate. So we don't actually have non-invasive blood pressure to choose from. And what that simply means is that that particular measurement has not been enabled as part of our protocol. So we talked a lot about protocols last time and how they really are truly a template for monitoring. And it's a template that's probably been established by the company, by the clinical specialist prior to us coming on site to do your training. And it allows the CNS monitor to recognize a specific set of devices and parameters for you. Now, of course, we can't think of everything, and there are sometimes things that come up that are different beyond when we have made your protocol. So if you're looking for a measurement that you can't find, you're going to have to actually enable that measurement as part of your protocol. So the way to do that is we're going to go down to this main menu button, which is sitting right here. And if I tap main menu down from that lower toolbar, I now have the ability to make sure that all of the devices that we want are truly enabled as part of our protocol, and that all of the measurements that we want. So right now, let's focus on the measurement, because that's what we really want to do for this purpose. So if I tap measurement, and then I can tap select measurements, give us just a second. Now we have all of those categories again that we're used to seeing, the hemodynamic, the neuro, respiratory, etc. And we can see which measurements have actually been enabled and the source that they are supposed to be coming from. So in this case, we're definitely getting our arterial blood pressure from the Philips IntelliVue. And I'm going to scroll down using my little arrow here down to NBP, which is our non-invasive blood pressure. And that's really what we're looking for. And it's alphabetical. And right there it is, NBP. And you can see that it has not been enabled as a measurement. So if I tap that, and in this case, we're using a Philips IntelliVue, but whatever your monitor is selected would be the one you're going to pick. Now I know for sure that I should be able to grab that measurement from my Philips IntelliVue monitor. And this is also a good opportunity to kind of scroll through and make sure that everything else we might possibly want that perhaps was forgotten in the original protocol can be found. And then I'm going to click Done. I'm going to exit my menus. And now I'm going to just do the same process that I did before when I wasn't really able to find my blood pressure. I'll tap on ABP. I'm going to go up to Edit Selected. And now I should have that NBP measurement available to me. Typically, when we're dealing with a pressure, it's going to be, if you'll remember that the values are displayed numerically, but then also as a trend. So typically when we're talking about a pressure such as an ICP or a blood pressure, we're talking about the mean. That's what we're going to display. So now our ABP has changed to NBP, and the trend that's going to be displayed is the mean. And now you look at this and you say, well, gosh, how do I know what my systolic and my diastolic are? So that's where we need to configure the label itself. So we've got the parameter. We know that the value is going to be our NBP, and it's coming from our Phillips. But if we want to make sure that we can see the diastolic and the systolic, we're going to tap right on the label. Previously, we had tapped in the middle of the parameter. Now we're going to tap the label. We're going to go up to Edit Selected. And right now, the readout or the number is following the trace, which we have set to the mean. But if we actually want to see systolic and diastolic, we can change it to that. So now we have our NBP instead of our ART, and we have our blood pressure, and the line or the trend will be representing the mean. So oftentimes we get calls from folks saying that I'm trying to add a parameter to my display, and I go into Edit Selected and into Measurements, and I can't find it. And the reason most likely for that is because it just hasn't been enabled for you as a measurement. So you can go back and do that. And once the measurement is enabled, then it will remain that way through the course of your monitoring. So,
the other thing I was going to add to that, Tracy, if you don't mind, is what I think sometimes people are also worried about is the Moberg device collecting that even if I can't see it?
right.
And the answer is yes and no, right? The answer is yes if you've selected it.
Correct.
But no if you haven't selected it from that measurements and devices area. So there are many things you could collect for retrospective review, for offline viewing and trending and exporting to other various analysis tools. But you do have to enable the device to know to look for that information. And it can be information that you even choose not to display at the bedside.
Absolutely. So if we were going back retrospectively and looking at this case, we would not see any data at all for non-invasive blood pressure because that measurement had not been previously enabled. So from this point on, we would definitely find data for non-invasive blood pressure. If there were data available for arterial blood pressure, even though the display has been changed to eliminate that, as long as the parameter is enabled, we would still see that data.
Yeah, so I think, clinically we love to see these things here, but if you're wearing both a clinical hat and a research hat, then think about when we talk about protocol development, think about all the parameters that you might want to include in analysis later, and that will help you to choose those things that may not have usefulness or variable usefulness at the bedside, but later might be really an important piece of your trend.
That's a really good point, the differentiation between clinical and research. So a good idea for you to do, even though we have helped you select your devices and select the measurements that you might want to see clinically, is just to go back into this main menu like we did, look at the measurements, and then go through each category and make sure that anything you think your team might be interested in gathering in terms of just having the data available with the data set is actually enabled. Because if it says none, it's not going to be collected. So it won't be collected.
And this has really been, like, I was just in a site yesterday, and because in the NICU, we might call something ABP, and everything ties back to your device, your bedside device labels. Sometimes we might choose ABP as we start a blood pressure on a baby, but sometimes we choose ART, or if we've switched to a peripheral ART line, we might get rid of UAP, so an umbilical arterial line, and switch. And so what happened for this one patient is we'd never enabled ABP. We'd only ever had ART and UAP, but the nurse had selected ABP and the trend wasn't visible. And so they couldn't figure out why. And so I think it's just one of those things where, you just sometimes live and learn. But just think of all the different labels that your staff may use and make sure you've just enabled all of those.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because whatever you have it labeled up on your bedside monitor, the label on your display on the CNS monitor has to be the same because it's looking for a particular data stream that matches a particular label. So if it's labeled ART at the bedside and it's labeled ABP on the CNS, they're not gonna translate to each other. So while Kathy was talking, you may have noticed I tried to enable ABP and I chose Philips. And the Philips monitor in particular has the ability to get both, which is good, but also lends some confusion. So now I get a dialogue saying, do you want to switch to it just being an ART label, or do you want to add that as part of an enabled measure? So now I could hit add ART, and now the CNS monitor will know to recognize whether it's ABP or ART, but still the display label has to match. And if you are concerned about, well, what labels are actually available, one of the things that we can do is go back to the main menu. And now if we look at devices, instead of measurements, and we look at select devices, they are also in categories. So typically with patient monitor, you're only going to have one type of monitor. I have several selected because I go through multiple protocols on my CNS monitor on my laptop. But typically you would simply select or make sure is selected the one at your device, at your institution. If you go over to the little information sign, it will tell you exactly what labels are available and are recognized by the CNS monitor. So if there's something that you have a particular label for, you might want to just double check and make sure that it is one that the CNS monitor is able to recognize. So all of these models of the Philips IntelliVue monitor are supported, and these are the particular measurements and the labels that can be transmitted over. So that's another good troubleshooting mechanism. If you have something labeled a little bit differently and the CNS monitor doesn't seem to recognize it, to make sure that it is actually one of the supported measurements. Have you run into any of that kind of stuff, Kathy?
Yeah, no, I've run into the label mismatch a lot. So this is really helpful. So I think if your hospital is using a label that's not on this list, this is also an opportunity for you to communicate back to the company and tell them, hey, this has become a trend in our unit to monitor this, or we wanted to do this, which one would you recommend? I think this list is really nice. You can just take a screenshot or a snapshot of this, and then you could think and again, I would go back to the research application. If you think you want one of these parameters later, even if you don't display it, these may be things you want to enable later, because some of these are just calculated values. Some of these are actually, collected values. So they may be helpful to have.
And sometimes what we find is it's just a matter of having a conversation with your biomedical engineering department, because when they install monitors, your cardiac monitors, there's typically sort of a basic set of labels, and then there's a more extended menu for labels. And oftentimes, they will just install sort of like the basic set of labels. And even though they are available within the monitor, they perhaps have not been enabled by the biomed department. So we've gone back and said, hey, the staff really have a need to look at some of these other labels. We know that they're in your monitor somewhere. Can you work your magic and make it so that they can access those? And they say, oh, sure. So that's another thing to consider, is just communicating with biomed. So the list for Philips IntelliVue is quite long. They have perhaps the most expanded list of available labels. If you look at something, if your hospital has the GE Solar, you still have a lot of labels to choose from, but it is more limited than the Philips. You'll notice you can only choose ART. There's no ABP measurement available. And then there are a few other limitations, but yet you do have some other things that other monitors don't have. There are 2 sources of ICP that can come from the Solar, which is great. If I choose the GE CareScape, if that's my monitor, a little bit more expanded data set, ICP and ICP2, CPP, CPP2, those kinds of things. So this is a good place to look at to see if the measurement that you actually want is one that's supported.
I also like that if you click on that GE Solar again, it also tells you which models are supported. And I know sometimes at least where I've practiced, we might put some of our older devices like in an isolation room, or, you know, you might have it back in the back closet, and you may have, you know, overflow. You might roll one of those out, and sometimes the Moberg won't talk to those older ones. And so this is a great place to go and maybe troubleshoot whether or not it is, you know, a device that if it could be swapped out, or you could use a different bed space. It might explain why your connectivity issues are occurring, because you think, well, that's a solar and that's a solar. Okay, well, but that's an older solar, and then we just popped it back here in the isolation room.
Right, great. So making sure that your devices are selected, making sure that your measurements are actually enabled, and my little mouse is hiding on me, there it is. And you can go through the neuromonitors as well and just make sure that everything that you use is in fact selected. If you use the older version of a Camino monitor or the newer version of the Camino monitor, makes a difference. If you've switched to the new Camo 2s, that's a different data stream than came from the MPM or the older Caminos. So you would need to update that in your protocol. Okay. So just some sort of troubleshooting types of things. So again, the devices are important, the measurements are important. Whoops, and I kind of can get myself in trouble here.
Tracy, there's a question. Do you want to field the question now?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so this is from John. He said, can measurements be archived automatically to a central hospital database, shared to tablet computers, shared over secured portals to other hospitals and researchers? Do you want to, I guess we can start with number one. Can measurements be archived automatically to a central hospital database?
So the answer to that is yes. It is an overall IT project, and what happens is your IT department has to allow a shared drive to be developed. So they partition some of the IT infrastructure on your network to a shared folder. And then the CNS monitor can be what we call networked to your hospital IT system. That's not the same as it being networked to your EMR. That's sort of a separate issue. But by networking it, it allows a solution for long-term storage of the cases that are on the CNS monitor. So it can be, the CNS monitor can then be configured to either dump that whole data case at the end of the case when the patient is discharged, or it can be configured to incrementally archive the data sort of as we go along the way. And that's important in the hospitals that are using the CNS monitor, particularly for EEG, because we want to have sort of a continuous and updated shared drive for people to look at. So then anyone who has access to that shared drive is able to tap into it and to look at that data. Now, the other way to view data from the CNS monitor is there's an accessory called the CNS reader. And the reader actually allows those cases to be viewed sort of in real time, or to go back and look at the data retrospectively. And that can be done from a tablet, from another desktop computer, and those kinds of things. So if you're interested in more information about those particular products, programs, or accessories, you can just let us know, and we can hook you up with the sales folks at Moberg, and they can talk to you about what those options are. Does that answer that question?
I think so, yeah. And John, let us know if there's, okay, he's saying thanks, so I think we're good.
Perfect. Okay. So I want to circle back to, we looked at devices, we're going to look at measurements again. And again, just kind of go through each category. Sorry, my computer's running a little slowly. So that was all the hemodynamic stuff. Here's all the neuro stuff. And just really be certain that every bit of, or every parameter that you think you might be interested in, even if it's not on a display, is enabled. Because that will help make sure that at least it's being collected in the background, even if it is not on the display. The other category are things that would likely be manual entry. So there is the ability to set up a manual measurement entry if we want to track things like sodium, if we want to track things like glucose. Most hospitals don't choose to do this because then if you set it up as a manual measurement entry, someone actually has to go in and type in that manual measurement. And your labs are typically accounted for in your EMR. So most hospitals don't do that, but there may be some special research applications where you want the sodium to be entered and you're tracking that along with ICP or something of that nature. So that can be done as well. Under respiratory measurements, we have things like CO2, end-tidal CO2. End-tidal CO2 is a question we get asked about a lot. Not all monitors, not all bedside monitors support the output of end-tidal CO2. So, and not all software versions on the CNS monitor support the upload of end-tidal CO2. So that's going to be specific to the monitors and the software programs you're running at your hospital. But if that's something that your team is interested in and you can't get that, again, you can just shoot us an email, let us know, and we'll try to investigate that for your particular site. We can do that. Temperature offers us a lot of different temperature sources. We can designate things to come from, say, the Arctic sun, from Blanketrol. There are a lot of different temperature sources available on your cardiac monitors as well. So we can enable a lot of those. So I'm going to bail out of that screen and just, again, remind you that when you're looking to add or configure a display, start by doing the edit selected. And if you can't find what you want, then go back and be certain that that particular device and parameter is actually enabled for use. I don't know, Kathy, and you can guide me if we want to get into this today, if we want to just leave some more time for questions. But the other thing to talk about is if you want to add a parameter to a screen and the parameters are sort of all used up, and that would be getting more into editing protocols in general.
Maybe we can show that specific aspect of changing protocols and then do a more comprehensive review of protocol next time we meet up.
Okay, that sounds great. So let's use this same particular display, and maybe because we are not completely trusting our art line, maybe we want to have the arterial pressure and the non-invasive blood pressure both on here, but I don't want to give up anything else. I've already got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parameters on here that I like. I just want to add one, but there doesn't really seem to be any room to do that. So the way we can address that is, again, go back to main menu. If you haven't spent time in main menu, there's a lot of cool stuff in here. And so we're kind of going through that as we speak. There's a tab that says Edit Protocol. So if I tap Edit Protocol, now I have the option to do a lot of different things. I can edit a particular step, which would mean editing one of these existing steps. I could completely add a new step if I wanted to. I could delete a step, and there's other things to do. What I want to do right now is I want to edit this nursing step. So I'm going to tap Edit Step. And the screen that I was working on was the vital signs screen, and I want to actually edit that display. So now here is the template of that display that we were looking at. We had our heart rate, our non-invasive blood pressure, CVP respiratory rate, O2, a temperature, and an ETCO2. I actually want to add my, my ABP or my ART measurement back in. So over on the side here is a button where I can add a trace. That gives us another, another parameter that we're adding. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to choose hemodynamic. And I'm going to choose ART. And again, typically that trend will be the mean. So now what it's done is it's added that arterial or the ABP measurement to the bottom. Maybe I want that to be up near the top, up by my heart rate and my non-invasive pressure. So again, over on the right-hand side, I can use this Move To button. I can tap that, and I can move it up here in second place. So this is also a good way to rearrange the parameters that are on your screen. You can change them around to a different order. So I've added my blood pressure back in. You will always have to review any changes that are made. And now it shows you what the display used to look like, and it shows you what the display looks like now. And then you can go ahead and accept those changes. You'll have to acknowledge that by saying okay, and back out one more time. And now if I go to my vital signs screen, I should see my heart rate. Here's my arterial blood pressure, but I want to change that label to actually get my systolic and diastolic. So I'm going to tap on that, edit selected, and instead of following the trend, I'm going to make that systolic and diastolic. So now I have both. Most of the software versions on the CNS monitor will allow you to put up to 11 parameters per screen. So you can actually get a display like this that looks quite busy. The fewer parameters you have on a display, the more real estate you're going to have. So that makes it a little bit more easy to look at. So I'm going to do that one more time, just as a review. Main menu. Now we'll do edit protocol. I'm editing that nursing step. And I am editing that particular display. So I can add a trace. I can actually delete a trace. Maybe my patient doesn't have their CVP monitor anymore. I can go over here and delete that. So you have a lot of ability to add parameters, take away parameters, rearrange parameters by using that Move To button. So that's a very helpful feature, and that's not something that we often focus on in training because it's a bit more of an advanced feature. So again,
Tracy, that was great. I was thinking maybe share the vacant trace because I saw that popped up there, and that might be a way
that's a great idea.
Where you have these patients who, have variable lines and monitors, but that you sometimes might want to do this or that.
Sure, perfect. So again, I would add a trace. I'd get into it the same way. I'd edit the step and edit the display, and I'd add a trace. And what Kathy was referring to is now instead of choosing one from the general category, I can actually add a vacant space. That kind of holds a parameter open for me to label anything that I choose to at a later time. So let's see what that looks like. Let's review changes, accept our changes. Okay, okay. And then I'm going to go back to that screen, which was our vital signs screen. And now we have our heart rate, our ART, our NBP. We got rid of CVP because we don't need that anymore. Respiratory rate, O2 sat, temperature, end tidal CO2. And now we have this trace that is labeled vacant. So at any time, I can come back in, I can tap vacant, go up to edit selected. Whoops, I didn't do it quickly enough. My mouse is a little draggy today. And I can choose any measurement that I want. I can put my CVP back in. I can choose a neuro parameter. Maybe I want to see ICP on that particular screen. So having a vacant trace is not a bad idea because it gives you a lot of flexibility to relabel things that may be sort of fleeting measurements for your particular patient.
Yeah, I like it for using it for those times when, as the patient progresses or as you might, be escalating care, you might want to add things, but that it can be flexible kind of, again, everything's being recorded. So depending on how you use your reader later, you'll be able to see all the trends, but at least for your display, it can be more flexible.
Perfect. Bear in mind, anytime that you make any of these changes, like we've done a lot of things. We added NBP, then we put back in ART, and then we gained a vacant trace, we took away CVP. Anytime you're configuring something specifically for your patient, the one thing to remember is that you are effectively changing the protocol. So you're changing that original template. We try really hard to keep the original templates the same so that every time you turn on the monitor, it looks the same. So one of the things that we really encourage, and maybe since we're getting down to our Q&A time, I can go ahead and do this, is when you discharge the patient from your CNS monitor, is unless it's a universal change that kind of everybody on your team wants, we would encourage you to discard any of those little individual changes that have been made. If everybody keeps saving their little changes to the next protocol, then they start to look very, very different from what the original intent was, and people have to do a lot of reconfiguring to kind of get it back. So I think maybe what I'll do to demonstrate that is I'm going to go ahead and discharge this particular patient, and we can admit another one if we need to do a little bit more work. But discharging a patient is always done in the very last step. For you, it may be number 5, it may be number 6. It's going to depend on how many steps you have. So if we tap Stop Monitoring, now I want to actually discharge my patient. And it says that we're not going to be able to gather any further data. Do we actually want to discharge? Yes. And now it says that the protocol has been changed. This dialog will only appear if, in fact, someone somewhere along the line changed the protocol. You may be the one discharging the patient, and you may say, well, I didn't make any changes, but I guarantee if you see this dialog, somebody somewhere along the line during the monitoring made some changes. So what we typically recommend is that you go ahead and discard any changes that have been made. If you hit save, it's going to update the protocol with all of those changes you've made. You can hit save as. Maybe you've created a protocol that you think is really awesome, and you want to save that under a different name and let somebody take a look at it, and perhaps they would want to readopt that as your unit's protocol. We want to avoid having too many protocols, though, because then it becomes confusing when you're admitting a patient as to which one to choose. So in general, tapping discard changes is always a good idea. And what that does is it reverts it back to the original protocol. And some of you may see this screen about what to do with the case. Some of you may not. Some of you have your monitors set up to automatically archive the data to your network, which is a great solution. Some of you have to archive to a USB thumb drive. And some of you, we have, if you have any question about what to do with the data when you're discharging a patient, just go ahead and tap Archive Later. And what that does is it moves that patient case file down into this tab that says Manage Data File. And it stores that case locally on the CNS monitor. So here's the case we were just working on. This is the protocol I was using. It was a demo protocol. I started my monitor at 10 o'clock this morning. This is when I discharged the patient. And one of the keys is that that data has never been archived. It hasn't really gone anywhere. It's just sitting in local storage right here on the CNS monitor. And that's fine, but eventually this data storage will get full. So your hospital really does have to have some type of archiving solution, whether it be to offload to thumb drives, but they have to be encrypted and secure, or whether it's archiving to a network solution. So we can actually then just be ready to readmit another patient. It's really important to discharge a patient from the monitor. If you don't discharge your patient, if you just turn the monitor off and unplug it and put it back in the closet, the next person who turns it on is going to be faced with a button up here that says Resume Monitoring, because the CNS is going to think it's still working on that same case file. So it's a really good idea to go ahead and go through that discharge process so that the monitor is set up and ready to go for the next patient. Anything about that, Kathy, that I missed?
No, that was a great overview. It looks like there's another question, so I'll go ahead and read that because I think it really fits in nicely. So is it possible to reset to factory default factory protocols, or to a hospital-specific default protocol as a base to build on for known monitoring scenarios? So I think that's probably what we're going to do as a whole webinar, is how to build your hospital or patient-specific protocol.
Yeah, so we will address that, but I'll kind of show you quickly. And the thing that caught my ear in that question was sort of default protocol. So if I go to admit a new patient, instead of hitting begin monitoring right now, I'm just going to look and kind of view and select protocols. You'll see in my list, there are a whole bunch of protocols, because this is the monitor that I use for teaching and training in a variety of different institutions. A brand new CNS monitor is going to have very few protocols in it. There will be one that says longitudinal bipolar, and that is basically just an EEG montage without any of the devices or measurements added. And that's typically what we start with. We typically choose longitudinal bipolar because it gives us a baseline EEG montage, and then we teach it the devices and the measurements sort of on top of that. You may also have one that is just called vital signs. So those are kind of the two factory default protocols. And vital signs, let me see if I can find that one. Sorry, there's so many in my monitor. If I just choose vital signs as the protocol, it's really not much of a protocol. Let's see what that looks like. Typically, when we are on site for training, we will give your educator or whoever sort of is your project lead a copy of your protocol as it was originally written, and they keep that on a thumb drive. So usually we will ask them for a thumb drive, we will import the protocol to their thumb drive, and they keep that as a pure copy. So if your protocol starts to morph into different things that you don't recognize, they can always re-import that baseline protocol. So if you find that your protocol is drifting, check with, it might be one of your nurse practitioners, it might be your educator, it might be your manager, but someone in the institution should have received that protocol that they have on a thumb drive. If they haven't, you can let us know, because Moberg Research keeps a copy of hospitals-based protocols. So we could give you that, and then you could use that as a starting point to rebuild if you wanted to. So you'll notice in the vital signs protocol, there's really just the setup step. There's a nursing step that doesn't have much in it. And then there's a discharge step. So that's just sort of that's also a very basic place that you can begin building, but it doesn't contain any EEG. So if your hospital needs EEG, we would want to make sure that we build from that longitudinal bipolar protocol.
Yeah, and for NICUs, we would usually build, if we were going to build a custom one, we would do it because we typically are only doing limited channel EEG as the NICU use. And for neonatal, we would choose, there's a bicentral biparietal option, and we would choose that for NICU as a base.
Let me see if I can show you the difference in what that looks like. If I look at the, I wonder why we don't have those in ours, Kathy. That's probably on my other monitor. You're the bicentral biparietal.
It may be the amplifier. I don't know if you have, yeah, because it uses the other amplifier.
Right. Let's try that. Good thought. There it is. So if you look at something like a biparietal protocol, it really is just two little electrodes, biparietal for our little neonatal patients. If you look at bicentral biparietal, now you have a few more electrodes. And if I go down to that longitudinal bipolar, which is typically where we start for adults, you can see there's a much fuller complement of EEG electrodes. So just the starting point for the protocols depends on first whether it's neonatal or adult, and then whether you need EEG or you do not, and then we build from there.
Perfect.
How about some other questions? And it doesn't have to be related specifically to this topic. We have a few more minutes.
Thanks, John. He said bravo on the design.
Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. Well, if no more questions come in, I'll just let you know that this session has been recorded, as has the previous webinar. So if you check back on the Moberg website, I'm not sure exactly how long it takes for them to transfer to there, but you will be able to find both of the webinars if you need to listen to anything again or see how to walk through things again.
That was great, Tracy. I learned a lot too, so always learning.
I always learn from you too, so we're a good team.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I liked the thing that you taught me that I didn't know how to do before was to edit the labels on the right-hand side of the screen. I always just teach people to touch in the middle. I always say, oh yeah, don't bother with that. I didn't realize that there was so much flexibility on that right side.
Yeah, because particularly with blood pressure, you want to see your diastolic.
Yes.
You don't necessarily want to just look at the mean. So being able to do that. And
are there other parameters that you find really useful to modify that label?
Actually not. It's really just blood pressure.
The blood pressure is the most.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to start implementing that on my protocols.
And once you do it as part of the protocol, it will actually hold that. But that would be a change that you would then need to save as part of the protocol.
Right. No, I like that though.
Good.
Perfect.
Right.
Thanks everybody for joining, and Tracy, thanks for guiding us through with all your wisdom. It's really always such a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you. Same with you, Kathy. And we'll, I'm not sure if we'll be able to get back together again in a month, or it might be a month and a half or so, but just kind of stay tuned to the website. And if you've registered for one webinar, you are likely to get an email that will tell you about the next upcoming one. So stay tuned for the date. If you guys have any particular topics that you're dying to learn about, please just shoot us some ideas, because we're really open. One of the things I would like to discuss next time, I think, is some of the operational buttons down on the bottom, the marking events, the taking snapshots, and those types of things.
I think those are all super practical day-to-day uses. So yeah, that would be great.
Perfect. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.